I've always been fascinated by gears. I love designing and building projects that use them. I just think they're so cool. There's just something about seeing them in action that is sort of mesmerizing. So with that in mind, I wanted to make a piece of art that uses them. Now I'm not thinking of just making a crappy frame and sticking a gear in it. I want to do something more elaborate, something that would really showcase the movement of the gears themselves. So I went online and I searched through hundreds of different types of gears, and there is a lot of different kinds of gears out there. Well, I found one, and it's going to be a challenging design. But I teamed up with the guys over at Onefinity, so between my tenacity and their amazing machine, I'm pretty sure I can pull this off. So that's what we're going to do today. Let's go make some art. So I'm going to be making a nautilus gear. This is sometimes referred to as a logarithmic gear, and that's because it's based on the Fibonacci spiral. And if you're a nerd like me, you know that the Fibonacci sequence means that each number in the sequence is the sum of the two preceding numbers in the sequence. So when you draw this out using squares, you can see that they start small and then they progressively get larger as you continue. Then using an arc tool, I can draw some semicircles that connect each square with its neighbor. And once they're all connected, you now have a Fibonacci spiral. At this point, I could connect the ends, trim off the parts I don't need, and then extrude the shape so that I could start to envision how this is going to work. And for me to really understand how they do work, I needed to duplicate the gear to make them turn on their centers. And at this point, I discovered that no matter how I turn one, the other could always be turned so that it was touching, even though they have this weird shape. Next up came adding teeth to the gears. Thankfully, Fusion 360 has a feature that allows me to replicate shapes along a path. So really, I just had to draw one tooth, and then I could tell it to replicate itself along the outside edge of the gear. This made it pretty easy and allowed me to get all the teeth drawn in there pretty quickly. Then came some other tweaks and adjustments so that the gears would work better together, and this required lots and lots of simulations and testing, but eventually I stumbled across a shape that seemed to work pretty well. So as I said earlier, this is called the nautilus gear, named after a nautilus shell that you might find at the seashore. Well, I grabbed a picture of one of those shells off the interwebs, and I made it the background of my design. Now I can literally just trace the spiral of the inner walls so that I can make this gear resemble that shell. And once I had it all connected, I could see it starting to take shape. What's interesting about these shells is that the insides are broken up into lots and lots of little rooms. So to mimic that, I created a bunch of arcs along this spiral and I copied the pattern right off the picture. In the end, this is what I was left with. That looks pretty sweet. At this point, I set up my toolpaths, I made sure things looked good on the simulations, I stuck the G-code on a USB stick, and I headed downstairs to the shop. The first thing I had to do was to figure out what kind of wood I wanted to cut this gear out of. So I wandered back and I started to sift through one of the racks of various cutoffs I've saved because I swore that one day I might need it. And after a bit, I settled on using a piece of curly maple and this piece of Australian Jarrah. Now it's time to set up the machine. This is the Onefinity X50 Woodworker, mounted on my mobile assembly table. Now this is one of their earlier designs, and they've since added even bigger and more capable machines to their product line. But one thing that clearly sets Onefinity apart from the rest is just how well built their machines are. I mean, you could drive a tank over this thing and it would be fine. Then once I got it all deployed, I could fasten down the workpiece and kick off the job. Now this one is using a 1/8 inch end mill, and the whole job took right about 20 minutes to complete. When it was finished, I could pry it off and load up the maple piece and get that carve going. Now that I have my gears, I needed to figure out what I was going to use for a background piece. And I think we all know that it needs to be black walnut. So I chop it down to size over the miter saw, and then I throw it back on the CNC so I can cut some mounting holes for the gears. One of these holes will be big enough for a bearing, and the other will be sized for the motor that I'll be using. At the router table, I could add a small roundover to soften the edges, and I'm sure to go backwards just a bit on the end grain so that I can avoid getting any tear out from the bit. a little sanding, and I'm ready to move on. Fortunately, my neighbor bought a new record player, and this motor just came right out of it pretty easily. I just put the two wires into this little connector, and then the cord from his desk lamp goes in the other side. And with everything connected securely, I can plug it in and test it out. And when I switched it on, you can see it turns really slowly, which will be perfect for this piece. Next up, I put the bearing in the top hole, and then I could scour my collection of hardware to find the most obnoxious looking flathead bolt that I could, in hopes to infuriate some of you. I drop that into place, and then I tighten it on using a self-locking nut from the back of the piece. I feed the shank of the motor through the bottom hole, and then I tighten on the other gear using some weird metric screw that I had to pay a fortune for at the hardware store because whoever designed the motor didn't use freedom units for their measurements. Then I could tighten on the motor to the back of the piece, and that portion was done. Now I wanted to build some legs that'll hold it at just the right angle to display it when it was sitting on a shelf. And to do that, I just used my digital angle gauge and just sort of eyeballed that 80 degrees seemed about right. I drew those angles onto the scrap piece of walnut that I cut off earlier. Then with the straight edge, I measured out about 5 inches along the bottom edge, and then I connected those points to form a couple of triangles. Then over at the miter saw, I used my shadow line to help me adjust the saw to the right angle, and then I cut both of those triangles out. Now, I knew it would be tough to clamp these legs on, so I didn't even try. I just put on a thin layer of glue, I got them in just the right spot, and then I just let them sit until they were dry. And once it had, I could take it all apart and get it ready for finish. I just wiped on some Danish oil because it's super easy to apply and it brings out the natural colors of the wood. And since it's not a film finish, I don't have to worry about evenly coating the surface or sanding between coats. Instead, I can just slather it on any way I can and call it good. But for the gears, I had to use my wife's toothbrush to really get the oil to go down into all the nooks and crannies. Now, it was right about at this moment when I had another idea. I grabbed another piece of Jarrah and I resawed it down on the bandsaw. And after that, it wasn't perfectly flat any longer, so I had to address that. And since it's too small to safely run over the joiner or to put through the planer, I'll use the 1-finity to flatten it. I actually use my CNC to flatten a lot of things. Cutting boards, coasters, anything end grain. It's super easy to flatten them on the 1-finity. I just use the gaming controller to do it, so there's no coating necessary. Plus, I can enter in the Konami Contra code so that if I screw this piece up, I get 30 more tries. Next, I figured, why stop at just one? Let's cut up a bunch of pieces. Then I fastened them all down onto the CNC table so that I could flatten them all at once. I can't begin to tell you just how nice it is to be able to flatten pieces this easily. And you can get much larger flattening bits too. This is just a 1-inch carbide bit, but there's lots of other options out there as well. And regarding dust collection, the only reason I'm not using it is so that I can get some good video of the carve actually happening. But 1-finity has some really great solutions available that'll keep your machine and your shop totally dust-free. Now that that's done, I'm left with 10 thin pieces of exotic woods. Next, I reach in and take out one of the tiniest bits I have. This little guy is a 1/16 inch end mill and will let me cut out a shape while maintaining the small details of the edges that would normally just get cut off if I used a larger diameter bit. I get that bit tightened into place, and then I use the Z-Pro block to tell the machine exactly where the corner of the stock is. Once I tell it to start, it uses a combination of electronic signals and wizard magic to detect exactly where the origin of your workpiece is so that it knows just where to start the carve. I plug in my USB stick and I pull up my file, and the brains in the machine double checks all my code to make sure that it all looks good. And with everything A-OK, I flip on the router, I hit play, and away she goes. So my idea was to make a whole bunch of little nautilus gears that I can put in a big line. I honestly don't even know if this is going to work, but I wanted to try nonetheless. And to make it even more interesting, I thought it would be neat if I made each one out of a different wood species. Then once they're all lined up, it'll be so neat to be able to spin the gears and see how they all work with one another, but also to see all the different colors and the grain patterns of the various types of woods. It'll kind of be a showpiece that's also something that you can interact with. It's kind of functional art. Now, my wife bought a new toothbrush since her other one was oily, so I grabbed it and I used it to clean out all the sawdust and the fuzzies from the little gears. Next, I had to do some trial and error until I could find the perfect spacing for each gear to spin smoothly. And once I had it figured out, I could start to work on making the base. So I grabbed a piece that was about the right size and I put a clean edge on it over at the joiner. Then at the table saw, I could trim it to width, and then I could cut it to length over at the miter saw. I got it clamped down onto the CNC and I loaded in a 1/4-inch end mill and I got things zeroed in. Then I kicked off a job that cut in 10 holes with recesses for bearings right down the center of the entire piece. I gave the front edges a quick round over, and then I used my laser engraver to put the names of each wood species under their respective mount locations. Then the bearings got pounded in, and then I could give each gear a good sanding. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing a glove, it's because the tiny little teeth on the gears were hurting my little princess fingers. Now at this point, I could wipe on some finish. And just like before, I splashed on some Danish oil onto the base, and then I dunked each one of the little gears like a tortilla chip into some salsa, which probably explains why I got kind of hungry during this step. Now the final task was to just put it all together and test out how well it works. Each gear has a washer that stands it off the bearing just a bit so that they don't touch the base. Then a self-locking nut secures them to the back side of the bearing, which is just friction fit and pressed down into the recess. This should allow them to spin as smoothly as possible, but I still don't know if this is going to work until I get the whole thing together. And speaking of that, here it is. Man, I just love how it looks with all the names on there, but I knew that I was bound to misspell one, but it's not my fault. The Jarrah came all the way from Australia, and the missing H, it didn't make it through customs. It's not my fault. So how well does it function? Well, pretty good. Smooth enough that I can operate it from just one end. However, there is enough resistance where if I tried to motorize it, I'm certain that the little wooden teeth would just break and the gears would strip out. But as far as fidgeting with it by hand, it works amazingly well. Plus, it's a fun showpiece where people can see what some exotic wood species look like. But what about the other art piece I made? Well, that one turned out spectacular. I just love how the larger nautilus gears look with the spiral cutouts on the inside. By removing all that extra material from the inside of each gear, it gives them each a real delicate appearance. The curly maple and the Jarrah are a great contrast to one another too. They complement each other like a set of opposites, like night and day, or like me and someone who's good looking. And the walnut base has some great character in it too, all sorts of colors that go well with the piece as a whole. But what's it look like when it's on? Well, absolutely hypnotizing. It doesn't matter how long I stare and watch this thing. It just doesn't seem like the gears should work with one another. And yet they do. What's really neat is to see that because the shape is based on the Fibonacci spiral, it means that the gears turn at different speeds based on where they meet with one another. So the upper gear spins its fastest when the lower gear is at its slowest, and vice versa. It's just another way that these two gears complement each other. And in that way, it sort of represents how a good marriage works too. Take my wife and I, for example. When she's at her low, it's my job to pick up the slack. And when I'm at my low, it's her job to bring me Cool Ranch Doritos. I'd like to thank Onefinity for sponsoring the video. This project would have been absolutely impossible for me to do without the help of their amazing machine. Now, if you're in the market for a CNC in your shop, you really need to get yourself one of their machines. In my experience, they are the absolute best ones out there in this category. You can see it for yourself over at onefinitycnc.com. Hey, thanks so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment down below. And if you're new here and you feel I've earned it, well, consider subscribing. I'd love to have you join the channel, and I'm sure you'd love all the other videos I have available on here. Well, that wraps up this one. Thanks again, Take care, and I'll see you next time.
Crap. Oh, crap. Oh. The heck? Holy crap. Wow. That was quite an explosion. Okay. Well, let's put in a new bit. Bummer.